Afternoon and welcome to Letter to Philippi Live, our daily teaching broadcast as we go through Paul's letter to Philippi, also known as the book of Philippians. And we will be looking today at Philippians 3, 9 through 11, continuing the section on the cost of knowing the Messiah. We looked at verses 7 through 8 yesterday, and now we'll conclude this section with verses 9 through 11 today. As we continue looking at the cost, Paul's talking about the cost of knowing the Messiah for the people in Philippi, and for us by example to understand the cost of knowing the Messiah, what we need to live for, what we need to be willing to give up for knowing him, and knowing the Messiah is greater than anything that we can have in this world. Take another quick cup. So let's begin today with a word of opening prayer, and then we'll get into our study. Oh, Lord, you're good. We thank you. We bless your holy name. We thank you for the words of your righteous servant Paul that we can look at today. Help us, Lord, to, as he calls us to become more and more and more in the Messiah each day. And help us to learn something new about you today that we can put into action in our life, that we can become more like you, who is our righteous Messiah. In whose holy name we pray. Amen. So again, welcome to Letter to Philippi Live. This is our daily broadcast going through the book of Philippians, Letter to Philippi, the letter that Paul wrote to the Philippian community, encouraging them in their faith. And for us as 21st century readers of this book, we too can look into how we can live our lives modeling the Messiah according to what we see from Rav Shaul here in his letter to the people of Philippi. This letter written around the 60s of the Common Era, so 1960 years ago is about when this letter was written, but still today, there's powerful teachings that Paul has here for us today, as he did for the people in Philippi over 1900 years ago. And first we're going to look at Philippians chapter 3, verse 9, which reads, "And be found in union with him, not having any righteousness of my own based on legalism, but having the righteousness which comes through the Messiah's faithfulness, the righteousness from God based on trust." Paul here states that the one thing of supreme value in his life, rendering everything else worthless, is knowing Yeshua and gaining the righteousness before God based on his trust in Yeshua and not on his human endeavors. It is by his union with the Messiah that he knows that he now has righteousness based on the Messiah's faithfulness. In his union with the Messiah, Paul knows that he has right standing before God, that it is an eternal state of being righteous before God based on the sacrifice of Yeshua, that his sinfulness was covered by the Messiah's sacrificial death, that in his connection with Messiah, he now knows life eternal. He now knows unending forgiveness of sins. Paul refers to himself in his letters as the chief of sinners, the greatest of sinners, because he himself persecuted the Messianic community and sent believers in Yeshua to their death. He saw himself as the greatest of sinners because he participated in this death of the followers of Yeshua. Even though he considered himself the greatest of sinners, he knew that he was also covered by the atonement of Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. That he was now knew the righteousness of God, and it was not based on any effort of his part, but solely based on his faith trust. And he's calling the people of Philippi to understand that too. that is in their faith trust as they go from pagan Gentiles to righteous Gentiles. That their right standing before God, their assurance of forgiveness of sins, is based solely in their faith trust in Yeshua. That whatever other teachers, we looked at the earlier in this chapter, the false teachers coming to Philippi, of which there's a strong understanding that they were teaching the Gentiles in Philippi that they needed to convert to Judaism to be fully a part of the people of God. But Paul's making clear to them that they are fully right before God. They're fully incorporated into the family of God, into the people of God by their faith, trust in Yeshua alone, that no effort on their part is necessary except for them to have the simple faith, trust in Yeshua. And as we'll see, their continuing actions continuing to be more and more like the Messiah, to focus their whole lives on the centrality of Yeshua in their life. Paul expresses his hope in his union with the Messiah, given that Paul has been granted the righteousness of Messiah by his trust in Yeshua. So Paul can express his hope and compel it on to the people of Philippi, and that's by example, that he knows his atonement has been made by Messiah. He knows that Yeshua's death on the Roman cross was for him and secured his place with God. His place with God was set by the example of the Messiah. The Messiah lived a complete life of Torah faithfulness. His life of Torah faithfulness and his atoning death covered all who put their faith in Yeshua. And Paul knew that he can have confidence and can compel confidence on the people of Philippi, and us reading this letter over 1900 years later, because of his faith, trust in Yeshua. He knew that for him and for all those who put their faith, trust in Yeshua, that they will have life eternal, a complete covering over all sins, and complete right standing for God. God who is holy and is beyond all, has given to us in the Messiah's death on our behalf, life eternal, and confidence that sin has been defeated in our lives. Though we may continue in this life to sin, we know that the atonement has been made for us. We should continue to confess our sins and bring them before God. But we know that forgiveness is available to us, that atonement is there because of the work of our righteous Messiah, Yeshua. Paul knows it is the righteous Messiah that made him right with God. Paul had found the Messiah, the one to bring redemption to Israel and the nations. Paul's life radically changed from being a persecutor of Yeshua and the Talmudim of Yeshua, the disciples of Yeshua, being a proclaimer of the Messiah, Yeshua, to the Gentile world. His union with Yeshua compelled Paul to devote the rest of his life to serving the Messiah. Let's read again this powerful thing, that this transformation in his life. Paul had found the Messiah. He had found the Jewish Messiah, one to bring redemption to Israel and the nations. And Paul's whole life was radically changed from being a persecutor of Yeshua and his disciples to becoming the great proclaimer of the message of Yeshua to the Gentile world, the apostle of the Gentiles. This union with Yeshua compelled Paul to devote the rest of his life to serving the Messiah. His encounter with Yeshua caused him to understand that he had to live his whole life dedicated to the work of the Messiah. To those in Philippi who taught that righteousness for God was through Torah observance, and those who do today who teach the same, as we said, that there's understanding that there was some false teachers coming to Philippi, and and were teaching the Gentile Yeshua followers that they were incomplete in their salvation, incomplete in their status of the people of God, as just Gentiles renewed in faith, as redeemed Gentiles. But they needed to also be circumcised and to live their lives fully as Jews. So for those who, and Paul is clear that those who were redeemed Gentiles were fully part of the people of God, and that their faith trust in Yeshua brought them in and grafted them into the tree of Israel. And they were to come to God as Gentiles and become righteous Gentiles. But these false teachers were saying that they were inadequate in their faith by not being also converts to Judaism. Paul is saying to those people who said that then, those who say that today, to say that Gentile believers in Yeshua are inadequate in their faith and not fully part of the people of God, Paul says that is incorrect and stands against that. And Paul clarifies that right standing with God is solely in union with the Messiah. Righteousness for God, inclusion in the people of God, inclusion in the people of the God of Israel, is solely in union with the Messiah. Righteousness for God is only available through the atoning work of Yeshua, where he exchanged our sinfulness for his righteousness. So Paul is making clear that salvation is only through the work of Yeshua. And for these Gentiles in Philippi, their full connection to, their full atonement, their full righteousness, their full connection to the God of Israel is by their faith trust in Yeshua. And they don't need to add anything to that. And Paul is saying, for those who put their faith trust in Yeshua, you are part of the people of God. Now, as ones who are part of the people of God, you need to live your lives to give glory to God and to live your lives to conform yourself to the image of Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. In Yeshua, God stepped into history and provided a way for final right standing for those who trust in Yeshua as Messiah and Lord, which we see in Jeremiah's prophecy in Jeremiah 23, 5-6, where we read, "The days are coming, says Adonai, when I will raise a righteous branch of David. He will reign as king and succeed. He will do what is just and right in the land. In his days, Yehuda will be saved. Israel will live in safety. And the name given in him will be Adonai Tzidkenu, Adonai our righteousness." Paul is making sure, via his own experience, that the Philippians know the righteousness of God is available only in Yeshua. Any effort at seeking righteousness before God outside of Yeshua falls short. In Romans, Paul spoke of the righteousness of the observant Jewish community, which we read in Romans 10. "Brothers, my heart's deepest desire and my prayer to God for Israel is for their salvation. For I can testify to their zeal for God, but is not based on correct understanding. For since they are unaware of God's way of making people righteous, and instead seek to set up their own, they have not submitted themselves to God's way of making people righteous. For the goal at which the Torah aims is the Messiah, who offers righteousness to everyone who trusts." Paul's point, Philippians 3:9, is that the only righteousness that he and the Philippians need is their trust in Yeshua, and not righteousness through their endeavors, even in circumcision or other actions on their part. Paul here is making clear to the Philippians that their full connection to the God of Israel is based on their faith trust in the Messiah. That for them to fully be a part of the people of God, they come to God as righteous, as come to God in faith in the Messiah and become righteous Gentiles. they become redeemed from the nations by their faith trust in Yeshua. And Paul is also speaking of himself as an observant Jew, understanding that his life of Torah and life observing Torah is an act of faithfulness to God, and not a way of earning salvation, but a way of living his life as a follower of Yeshua. That the Torah is the way of a life for a redeemed community. So as Paul continues to live his life as an observant Jew, as a follower of Yeshua the Messiah, his continuing acts of Torah observance is an act of him obeying and showing his love for God, as we've seen the words of our righteous Messiah Yeshua, where he says that if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, and I will grant you the power of the Spirit to fully live out my words. So we see that there is an understanding that Paul has here, that righteousness comes only through Yeshua and only through the atonement that he made, and that any actions on our part in observing Torah is a continuing act of obedience to God, not a way of earning salvation. That's one of the great misunderstandings that many teachings on the Jewish people among the different church communities and commentators, seeing that there is somehow in Judaism a sense of trying to earn your place with God by your works. But we see that Paul here is understanding, as an observant Jew, that his observance of Torah is an act of obedience to God, and that his understanding of his standing before God is based on the Messiah's faithfulness, on the Messiah alone and his atoning death that brings life eternal to both him and to all who put their faith trust in Yeshua. In verse 10 we read, "Yes, I gave it all up in order to know him, that is to know the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, as I am being conformed to his death." Paul reflects on what he gave up, as stated above, considering all that he had previously valued in his life, even his spectacular Jewish resume, to fully know Yeshua and to model himself like his Messiah. We can see here Paul acknowledging that in Yeshua he has received what Moses and the other prophets had hoped for, the reality of intimately knowing God because of the work of Yeshua on his behalf. This reality included taking on suffering like his master. It is in seeking to more fully know Yeshua and experience the power of the resurrection life in Messiah that has become Paul's sole passion. Considering his Damascus Road experience, Paul's life is a continuing striving to conform himself to the Messiah, to gain the resurrection only Yeshua offered. So Paul here is making clear that everything that he had in his life, everything of great value, he was willing to lay aside for the knowledge of the Messiah, to know Yeshua, to know the power of the resurrection, the assurity of life now and the surety of life forever in Messiah, in the presence of the God of Israel, life eternal in the holiness of the Messiah, covered by the atoning work of the Messiah, covered by the blood of the Messiah, fully apart and fully atoned for. And Paul says in grasping this, he was willing to give up everything, and even just to suffer, and even to be willing to give his life for the Messiah, which we know that not long after this letter is written, Paul would be executed under Roman Emperor Nero. But to know Yeshua, he was willing to give everything of value in his life, and even to be to suffer and to die with his knowledge of the Messiah. That the knowledge of the Messiah, the knowledge of the power of his resurrection, the resurrection life that he acquired by his faith in Yeshua, made him willing to give up everything and to even suffer and die for the Messiah. And he calls people of Philippi to so embrace the Messiah, so embrace their connection with Yeshua, that they too will be willing to lay down their lives for the Messiah, be willing to suffer for the Messiah, and if death is required, to be willing to lay down their lives for him. As we see that today, even today, throughout our world, there are many people, even today, who will give their lives for the knowledge of Yeshua, for their connection to Yeshua, for their faith in Yeshua. They will lay down their lives. And Paul's calling people of Philippi and us to have that level of commitment, that willingness to embrace the Messiah so deeply that whatever persecution or even death is required of us, we're willing to give it all, to give all of our lives for the knowledge of the Messiah, and to know that in him we have life eternal. So we'll be concluding today with verse 11, which Paul says, so that somehow I might arrive at being resurrected from the dead. Paul here is not questioning his eternal destiny. As we've seen in the previous verse, that he is assured of life eternal. He's assured that he knows the power of the resurrection. He knows the assurance of his salvation. He knows his assurance of his atonement. He knows the assurance of life eternal in Messiah. But Paul here is stressing the importance of his continuing to strive to model Yeshua in his life, continuing each day to become more and more and more in the Messiah. And though he knows his eternal destiny is secure, though he knows that life eternal is awaiting him at the end of the line when his life comes to an end, Paul here knows that each day from his encounter of the Messiah until he takes his final breath is to become more and more like the Messiah, more and more like his master, more and more in the image of the Son. And he's saying that this is the passion of his life, and he calls people of Philippi and us to also understand that we need to focus our lives daily to become more and more and more in the Messiah, and to understand that that is what our life is about. As our encounter with Yeshua compels us to live our lives, to glorify the God of Israel, and to model our righteous Messiah, to model his humility, to model his self-sacrifice. And Paul commends this same striving to the Philippians and us by example. Paul understood that the goal of his life was the resurrection and eternal life with Yeshua. But he knew that until that day came, he was to continue to strive to be more and more and more in the Messiah. And he calls the Philippians and us by example to also focus that in our lives, that each day that we seek to become more like the Messiah, we seek to more model him in our world that gets darker and darker in sin each day. That we are to be lights in this dark world. We are to be ones who stand out as the Talmudim of Yeshua, that in our connection to Yeshua, people will know that we are lights in this dark world. And Paul calls the people of Philippi here to understand that their place in relation to God is secure, but their goal needs to be continuing to strive toward that destiny, which is truly there. But he calls them to continue to model their lives after the Messiah each day, to live as redeemed Gentiles in this world, and to live as followers of the God of Israel, and to once model themselves after the Messiah of Israel, and ordering their lives according to the scriptures of Israel. So Paul here concludes this section talking about the cost of a Messiah, that he was willing to give up everything in his life, everything of value in his life, he was willing to consider worthless for the knowledge of the Messiah. Everything of value in his life, he was willing to lay down for the knowledge of the Messiah. And even here he says that moving forward, he was willing to suffer and even to die for his faith in the Messiah. So as he continues to strive to become more and more like the Messiah, more like his master. And he calls people of Philippi to understand that in their new life, in their new connection to the God of Israel, through their hearing the good news of the Messiah, they too must value their knowledge of the Messiah over anything else in their lives, and to focus their lives to become more and more like the Messiah. There was a continuing journey of faith. Though their atonement is sure, their standing with God is sure, their faith trust has brought them into connection with the God of Israel and within the Commonwealth of Israel. They now are to continue to live their lives as redeemed Gentiles in a dark world, and to stand as lights within the darkness, and to stand as people who continue to seek to become more like the Messiah each day. So that will conclude our look at verses 7 through 11, which I call the cost of following the Messiah. And tomorrow we'll get into the next section of the book, which I entitled The New Life in the Messiah, where Paul will continue to teach the people of Philippi, and us by example, what it means to become livers in the new life of Messiah, that what it means to be enlivened in the Messiah and be a part of the new life that's in the Messiah, and what it means to fully live out the new life as followers of Yeshua. For the Philippian community, which I said was mostly a non-Jewish, mostly a Gentile community, with some Jews, they said that we do see in Acts 16 that there was a small Jewish community, of which Lydia, who was a member of that community, became one of the first leaders of the Messianic community. So Paul is bringing here for them to understand that they're now living a new life. They're no longer living as pagan Gentiles in Philippi, but they're now living as followers of the God of Israel in Philippi. And they were to understand that they have entered a new life, and they are to live in the light of the Messiah in their life each day. So we'll be looking at that tomorrow as we continue our study here on the Letter to Philippi Live. My name is Sean Emslie. I'm the founder of Letter to Philippi and your teacher. If you want more information, you can go to our website, lettertophilippi.org. You can find previous message recordings, both audio and video. You can purchase a copy of my Messianic commentary on Philippians on a resources page, which is the basis for this class. You can leave a prayer request. I want to be praying for you, and we'll talk more about the importance of prayer when we get into chapter 4 of Philippians. If you'd like to ask any questions, we have a contact form. We'd appreciate it if you make a contribution to the work of Letter to Philippi. We're a nonprofit organization, and we appreciate if you can make a one-time or even a monthly contribution to keep the work of Letter to Philippi going, complete these teachings going, and also to expand on our work that we want to move out into the community and bring the words that Paul has given the people of Philippi, and also to expand on our work of building a 21st century Messianic Jewish theology that is firmly grounded in the scriptures of Israel, in the traditions of the people of Israel, and in the works of the Besorah, the works of the apostles of Yeshua, to build an understanding of what our faith is, what Messianic Judaism is in connection with the scriptures and the traditions of our people, as we continue to build and grow this work of living life following the Messiah of Israel as faithful Jews and faithful Gentiles following the God of Israel, and building a Messianic Judaism that will continue throughout the future as we continue to build this work to give honor to the God of Israel and to live as faithful Jews following the Messiah of Israel. So again, if you have any questions or comments, or as I said, want to leave a prayer request or make a contribution, just go to lettertophilippi.org. For those watching on Facebook and Twitter, there's the stream on the bottom, which has the website information. And for those on Instagram, we have on our profile page, we have the address. So again, this is Sean Emslie. This is Letter to Philippi Live, a continuing study Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, 10 p.m. Jerusalem time. And we'll continue our study through Paul's letter to Philippi, and see you tomorrow. So thank you for watching. We appreciate you watching, and I look forward to looking at Paul's next section of this letter, the new life in Messiah, and calling the people of Philippi, and us by example, to fully embrace our new life, a life that we have in the Messiah of Israel. So thank you for watching. Have a great day, and shalom.